For more than a century, global trade has depended on a small number of man-made shortcuts, a handful of narrow passages like the Panama and the Suez Canals that quietly determine how fast goods move, how much shipping costs, and which countries control the flow of commerce. But those shortcuts only work when nature cooperates and geopolitics stay relatively calm. And in the past few years, both assumptions have started to break down. Droughts have repeatedly restricted traffic through the Panama Canal. Conflict and instability have made large portions of the Red Sea and Suez route risky or unusable for many shipping companies. When either of these corridors slows, the effects ripple through supply chains across the entire world, and the environmental and community consequences of finding new routes grow just as quickly. That pressure is forcing governments and shipping companies to revisit an idea that, until recently, sounded unrealistic: using the Arctic Ocean as a commercial shipping corridor. As polar ice retreats during summer months, routes that were once locked behind solid ice are opening long enough for ships to pass through. These passages can cut thousands of miles off traditional voyages and bypass some of the world's most vulnerable choke points. Some nations are already investing heavily in ports, icebreakers, and Arctic infrastructure. Others are quietly falling behind. So, today we're breaking down why the world is suddenly paying attention to Arctic shipping routes, how real these routes actually are, and whether they pose a genuine long-term threat to the Panama and Suez Canals. And if you enjoy deep dives into the infrastructure, engineering, and geopolitical forces quietly reshaping the global economy, make sure to hit the subscribe button. For decades, the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal worked so reliably that the shipping industry built its entire operating logic around them. Routes were optimized. Vessel sizes were standardized. Delivery schedules assumed these shortcuts would always be available. That assumption is now weakening. Let's start with Panama. The Panama Canal depends on fresh water. Every ship that passes through its lock system consumes millions of gallons of water drawn from Gatun Lake and surrounding reservoirs. That water is released into the ocean and cannot be reused. When rainfall is normal, the system works. When rainfall drops, everything breaks. In 2023 and 2024, severe droughts pushed Gatun Lake to critically low levels. Canal authorities were forced to reduce daily ship transits, restrict vessel draft, and prioritize certain cargo types. Ships waited days or even weeks for slots. Some carriers paid millions of dollars in auction fees just to move up the queue. Others rerouted entire fleets around South America. Panama has responded with plans for a new reservoir and water transfer system designed to stabilize supply for decades. But major construction is not expected to begin until later in the decade, and completion could stretch out into early 2030s, which means Panama remains vulnerable. Now, look at Suez. Unlike Panama, Suez does not rely on freshwater locks. It is a sea-level canal. Its problem is not water, it is security. Since 2023, attacks and drone strikes near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and Red Sea shipping lanes have made large portions of the route high risk for commercial traffic. Insurance premiums have surged. Naval escorts have become common. Many major carriers now routinely divert ships around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of extra miles to voyages between Asia and Europe. Egypt expanded the Suez Canal in 2015, specifically to increase capacity and reduce transit time. But today, capacity is not the limiting factor, risk is. So, for the first time in modern shipping history, both of the world's most important shortcuts are constrained at the same time. Not by engineering limits, but by climate and geopolitics. That combination is what makes alternative routes suddenly worth serious attention. But what alternatives are there? Well, that's where things get a little surprising. For most of modern history, Arctic sea routes existed more as theory than practice. Yes, explorers mapped them. Yes, icebreakers occasionally forced passages through. But commercially, the Arctic was a dead end. Too much ice, too little infrastructure, too much uncertainty. That is now changing. Each summer, Arctic sea ice retreats farther and for longer periods than it did just a few decades ago. The navigable window, once measured in weeks, is now measured in months. Roughly from late July through early October, parts of the Arctic Ocean open enough for ice-strengthened commercial vessels to pass. Within that window sits a route with extraordinary implications. Stretching across Canada's Arctic archipelago, it connects the Pacific and Atlantic through a maze of channels north of the continent. On a map, the advantage is obvious. A voyage from East Asia to the U.S. East Coast via Panama is roughly 10,500 nautical miles. Using the Northwest Passage, that distance drops to around 8,600 nautical miles, nearly 2,000 miles shorter. On a large container ship, that can translate into about a week less sailing time, a week less fuel, a week faster delivery, a week sooner before the ship can begin its next revenue voyage. That is not a theoretical advantage. Chinese icebreakers and ice-class cargo vessels have already tested the passage on long-distance routes. European operators have moved bulk carriers, mining supplies, and industrial cargo through the corridor. Specialized ships with reinforced hulls and dual-direction designs now transit without constant escort. Not in massive numbers and not year-round yet, but regularly. And that distinction matters more than it might seem, because shipping doesn't shift overnight. It shifts through repetition. One successful voyage becomes a handful more. Those become seasonal schedules, and seasonal schedules are what justify long-term investment. That's the curve the Northwest Passage is now entering. It isn't replacing Panama or Suez, but it no longer belongs to the category of fantasy either. It's crossed into something far more important, a real seasonal shipping corridor that companies can plan around. But a shipping route doesn't become strategic simply because a few ships pass through it. It becomes strategic when countries start building around it. That shift is now underway across the Arctic. On the Canadian side, the most important anchor point is Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill sits on Hudson Bay and holds a rare advantage. It's the only deepwater Arctic port in North America that's directly connected to the continental rail network. Grain, fertilizer, minerals, and industrial cargo can move by train from the Canadian interior straight to the coast, then out toward the North Atlantic. For years, that advantage barely mattered. The Hudson Bay Railway deteriorated. Investment dried up. Traffic remained limited. That's now changing. Canada's federal government has committed hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuilding the rail line and expanding port capacity. Manitoba has added additional funding. The rehabilitation includes stabilizing permafrost sections, replacing washed-out bridges, strengthening embankments, and upgrading signaling across more than 600 miles of track. The goal isn't to turn Churchill into a megaport. It's to make it a reliable northern logistics gateway capable of handling steady, predictable Arctic trade. Further east, Canada is also upgrading Arctic facilities on Baffin Island and across Nunavut. These aren't traditional container ports. They function as seasonal refueling points, resupply bases, and presence stations. Most consist of reinforced docks, fuel storage farms, modular warehouses, and hardened mooring systems designed to survive moving ice and extreme tidal forces. They allow patrol ships, icebreakers, and support vessels to operate deeper into the Arctic and stay there longer. On the American side, the focal point is Nome, Alaska. Today's Nome's harbor is shallow, roughly 22 feet deep. That's too shallow for large Coast Guard cutters, heavy icebreakers, and deep draft cargo ships. Most larger vessels still have to anchor offshore and move cargo by barge. The Port of Nome expansion is meant to change that. The project will extend the main causeway, add new docking facilities, and gradually deepen the harbor toward roughly 40 feet. Phase 1 alone carries a price tag of roughly $400 million and involves dredging millions of cubic yards of material, constructing new sheet pile quay walls, and installing heavy-duty fender systems capable of absorbing ice pressure, deep enough to host large government vessels, resupply ships, and eventually commercial Arctic traffic. If completed as planned, Nome would become the first true deep draft Arctic port in the United States. But ports alone don't create Arctic shipping. You also need ships that can survive in ice. For decades, the U.S. maintained a minimal icebreaker fleet, essentially one aging heavy icebreaker and one medium icebreaker. That posture is now shifting. A new heavy polar security cutter is under construction. Each of these vessels is expected to cost well over $1 billion and displace more than 20,000 tons with reinforced hulls, massive propulsion systems, and the ability to break through several feet of solid ice. Taken together, Arctic port expansions, icebreaker construction, rail rehabilitation, and support infrastructure across North America are already pushing into the multi-billion-dollar range. and long-term estimates suggest Arctic shipping preparedness could ultimately require tens of billions of dollars in public and private investment. The Coast Guard has acquired a commercial icebreaking vessel for conversion into a medium polar icebreaker, and the U.S. has partnered with Finland to accelerate production of additional Arctic-capable cutters. But this doesn't put the United States anywhere near Russia's icebreaker capacity, because while the US and Canada are only now rebuilding Arctic capability, other powers are already operating at scale. Russia runs multiple nuclear-powered icebreakers, and China has declared itself a near-Arctic state with explicit polar shipping ambitions. Along Russia's northern coast, the Northern Sea Route is already moving tens of millions of tons of cargo per year, supported by a large fleet of nuclear icebreakers and a growing chain of Arctic ports. That corridor mainly serves Europe-Asia trade rather than North America, but its existence proves something important. Arctic shipping is no longer theoretical. It is already functioning at scale in at least one part of the world, which helps explain why, for the first time in decades, the United States is planning for sustained Arctic operations rather than symbolic presence. Taken together, these projects signal a clear shift. Canada and the United States are no longer treating Arctic shipping as a distant possibility. They're laying the physical groundwork for a future where Arctic routes are normal enough to justify permanent support. For more than a century, global trade has depended on a handful of engineered shortcuts: Panama, Suez, narrow corridors that concentrate enormous economic power into very small geographic spaces. What we're seeing now isn't the sudden collapse of those routes. It's something slower and more structural, a gradual shift toward redundancy. Climate volatility is exposing how fragile water-dependent canals really are. Geopolitical instability is reminding shipping companies how vulnerable narrow choke points can become overnight. And melting Arctic ice is revealing geography that has been locked away for thousands of years. The Northwest Passage will not replace Panama, it will not replace Suez, but it doesn't need to. It only needs to exist as a credible alternative. But what do you think? Will Arctic shipping become a permanent part of global trade? Should the US and Canada invest far more aggressively in the Northwest Passage? Or is this a risky bet on a route that will always remain marginal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep dives into the mega projects and infrastructure shifts quietly reshaping the global economy, make sure to hit the subscribe button.